You are listening to the Space-Tastic Mysteries podcast. We are continuing Anna Gale Line's third novel in the Jaguar and Peacock series, Lost on Planet M-142. Trapped on the hostile world of Planet M-142, Commander Jessa Peacock Masters of the Intergalactic Intelligence Bureau has spent 3 grueling months undercover, investigating a mysterious cult led by the enigmatic blind prophet, Danielle Jabot. Is Jabot a visionary, a fraud, or something far more dangerous? The deeper Jessa digs, the more tangled the web becomes: secrets, deception, and whispers of an impending assassination. When her husband and fellow operative, Nate Masters, finally joins her, their mission takes a deadly turn. Someone wants Danielle Jabot dead, and the list of suspects is as vast as the stars. As Jessa and Nate race against time, they must navigate a treacherous world of fanatic followers, shadowy enemies, and their own rekindled partnership. With every step closer to the truth, one question looms: is Jabot the target, or the mastermind? This is episode 4, Questions and Consequences. If you have not subscribed, do so now, and hit the bell to be notified of new episodes.
I'm sorry that I haven't been in touch much, I told Danielle Jabot as I sank down in the chair to the left of her desk, but I've been under the weather. So Nate told me, Danny answered, leaning forward in the swivel chair behind her big metal desk. The poisonous chemicals in the fire at the bank that the bomb started caused you to sleep for 10 days? Danny folded her hands under her chin. I'm glad that you are feeling better. Although I am hearing some exhaustion in your voice. She moved her hand around her desk, picking up a pencil. She shuffled it between her fingers and prompted, You said you have some suspects. Yes. I touched my index finger. Amy Jo Dawson. The lieutenant mayor has been vocally renouncing our group for months. She has had our members arrested on several occasions. During some of the recent protests, she has tear-gassed us and had her guards fire on us, remarked Danny, leaning back in her chair. She folded her arms across her chest. But do you think she is capable of this type of violence? And why would she want to hurt the other members of the community? They just re-elected her and the mayor. She shook her head violently. Who else? I tapped my middle and index fingers. Thomas McCready, the businessman we exposed last year for taking bribes in exchange for voting against environmental-friendly bills. I reached for Nate's hand, clutching it tightly. I flashed him a small smile before adding, he vowed to get us back. He did plant a similar bomb in the compound a few months ago, and I always suspected that he planted the bomb that took her voice trailed off. You had another suspect? It's more of a group of people. Anyone who has been kicked out of the compound or who you have denied membership to, could want to pin this bombing on us. That's a long list, if you can believe it. But how many of them hate the community enough to risk killing innocents? I don't know, Danny admitted. She moved to the edge of her chair and said in a low voice, We have had some real weirdos come through here, people who think they're aliens, others who think they are spies, even ones who believed there was life beyond this planet, some planet called Earth. Nate and I exchanged glances. Wow, I exclaimed, then another idea hit me. Could any of our current members have done this? No, Danny hollered, raising halfway from her seat. How can you even ask that? Then her features melted. Maybe, I don't want to believe that our own would turn on us, but I suppose anything is possible, she assented, slipping back into her chair. You sound like you have some definite leads. Have Mason make you a list of our current and past members. After obtaining the list from Mason, Nate and I gathered vegetables at my greenhouse to sell to Saber. If we had to stay here for a while, we were going to need money. Before we walked through the doors of March Mercantile, Nate peeked through the window. He pressed me up against the wall next to the door, giving me a long kiss that multiplied into more kisses. I pulled away, raking my eyes over him. Not that I am complaining, but what was that for? He drew me closer to him, whispering into my ear, Because I love you, and I've missed you. I nodded, pursing my lips as I looked into his eyes. And it had nothing to do with the fact that the man in there, I prodded, motioning toward the doors, looks like the man I left you for in your dream. He ran his hand over the back of my hair. Am I that obvious? I kissed him and rubbed my index finger over his lips. Only to the person who knows you best. That would definitely be you, he agreed, glancing over at the doors of the mercantile. He has an obsession with you. The last time I was in here, I tried to explain to him that you and I, Nate expressed, gesturing between us, we are together, and he kept going on about your and his kids and your and his wedding. It's a harmless, little crush. He grabbed my shoulder. No, it's more than that. I have a gut feeling about him, and coupled with that dream, I don't want you to be alone with him anymore. Although I think you are making a big deal over nothing, I will do it because you asked me so nicely. Putting my hand on the doorknob, I pushed the door open, leading Nate inside. Saber stood on a ladder, wiping down the top shelf behind the counter. Good morning, Saber, I greeted, placing my basket on the counter. I glanced back at the door and observed, I see you had the doors fixed. He stole a peek at me, looking at me longingly. His eyes seemed to swallow me up. And for the briefest moment, I wondered if Nate was right that Saber's crush had turned into an obsession. I pushed it out of my mind. Jada, Saber greeted. He beamed as he scurried down the steps, rounding the counter until he came face to face with me. He picked me up and swung me around, exclaiming, "You're alive." I shot Nate a desperate look as Saber kept spinning me. I thought that I might vomit on Saber's shoes. When he finally put me down in front of Nate, Saber kissed me full on the lips. I pushed him away, then slapped him hard across the face. I stood away from him and squinted my eyes, raking them over him like coals over a fire. He nursed his jaw, staring at me, smiling. It doesn't bother me that you are with him, he voiced, nodding to Nate, who stood behind me, because I know in time, you will come to love me as much as I love you. I reached for Nate's hand behind me, turning my head toward him. Let me handle this. I took a step toward Saber, batting my eyelashes and tilting my head. Until then, I determined, I hope we can be friends. Of course, Saber agreed, moving back around the counter and lifting the lid of the basket. I know that bombing has us all under a lot of stress, and when we are under stress, we do crazy things. I leaned against the counter and prompted, speaking of the bombing, did anyone buy anything suspicious right before the bombing? Not really, he said, removing a pepper. He weighed it in his hand, studying its color from every angle. He squinted and twisted his mouth. He declared, wait a minute. He looked up at me and wagged his finger, and supplied, Mason came in here a few days before the bombing with a list from Danielle Jabot. He scratched his head as if trying to remember what was on the list before providing, a pipe about 1 foot long, fine gunpowder, a solar igniter and a battery. He took several vegetables from the basket, running his hands over them. When I told him, Saber went on, I didn't have the materials and that I would have to order them, he seemed agitated. Nate and I exchanged curious glances. He crinkled his eyes, and his lip twitched, as they did at that moment, when he didn't believe someone's statement. He didn't believe Saber any more than I did. Where did you order the items from? I inquired, watching him scrutinize the scales of several artichokes. From a friend of mine's store in Veron's Crossing. He peeked up at me. Why are you asking so many questions? You act like you are conducting an investigation. Maybe because I am, I replied, running my tongue over my teeth. On whose authority? Danielle Jabot's. Why are you involved with that head case? He checked the leaves on a head of cabbage, not looking up. She didn't do the bombing, and I intend to prove it. How are you going to do that? It's not like you have any experience with this type of thing. Nate and I burst into laughter. What's so funny? Saber demanded, raising his head to meet my eyes. Jada and I have been partners on the police force in Blue Grove for over a decade, Nate interjected, pressing down on my shoulders. Now that you mention it, I did think it was weird when you pulled that gun out the day of the bombing and headed right into the chaos. Saber marched over to the cash register. After pressing a few buttons, the drawer flew out. Saber pulled several bills from the sections and gathered some change. He carried the money over to me and counted it out in my hand. If I can answer any more questions, let me know. What's the name of your friend in Veron's Crossing? I asked as I slid the basket on my arm. I don't see why you need that piece of information. Fine, I said, putting my hands on my hips. If you want to look guilty by not cooperating with our investigation, that's your prerogative. I spun on my heel and marched toward the door. As I reached for the doorknob, he called after me, Jensky Gavril. I turned my head to glance at him. Thank you. Outside, I met Nate's gaze. You were right, I confessed, sorting the bills that Saber had given me, small bills up front, large bills in the back, all facing the same way. Saber does have more than a crush. If he isn't involved in the bombing, he knows something about it. Yes, but what? I don't know. I intend to find out, though. I looked both ways before crossing the small street, heading toward the business quad. Now that we have a little cash, I think we should go to the bank. Nate held out his hand as he fell in step with me. Until they rebuild the bank, they are running it from the trailer next to the rubble. I felt annoyed, wrinkling my nose. I had been asleep for 10 days, and when I awoke, Nate knew more about what was happening in Star Oak than I did. And I spent 3 months on this planet. I grabbed his hand, glancing at him, feigning a smile. I walked toward the trailer. I couldn't bring myself to be mad at Nate, the man who had loved me and fathered the baby I carried. I proceeded up the steps that led into the trailer, pulling open the door. Peering in, I noticed that a line of people started at one end of the trailer and ceased at the door. I pushed my way through the crowd, scribbling my name on the sign-in sheet for those customers who needed special attention. Just as I finished the S in Williams, the floor underneath me started to rumble like an angry dragon awaking from his nap. I held onto a nearby desk for support, and Nate held on to me. The glass of the windows shattered in a million pieces, spitting the fragments all over the trailer. People screamed hysterically. It's okay, everyone, I called over the loud roar and screaming. Get away from the windows and doors. Find somewhere to take cover, preferably something big like a desk. Everyone looked at me for a moment before they returned to their screaming. My colleague and I have been in this situation many times, and we are alive to tell the story. Now if you want to stay alive, you will do what we say, I commanded, forcing myself to the front of the room. I hopped onto the counter and stood up so that I could see the entire crowd. The yelling ceased. Now, I barked when all eyes were focused on me, I am going to go over this once again. Pointing to the people near the doors and windows, I instructed, all of you, move inward. I raked my eyes around the room and bid, the rest of you need to find something large to hide behind. Most of them scurried to scout out a place to crawl behind. Some hesitated. I sat back down on the counter, jumping off. The line for corpses begins over there, I said, pointing to the door. Nate and I rounded the counter, tucking ourselves behind it. We asked questions at March Mercantile, and now another bombing, Nate whispered, intertwining his fingers with mine. Coincidence? I don't think so. Before I could answer, the ground rumbled again. Peeking around the corner, I watched picture frames, staplers, trays, and even computers fall off desks, crashing to the floor. Small fires popped up all over the trailer. Edging out from behind the counter, I crawled to the front. Peek, Nate said in a stern voice, it's too dangerous. Suddenly, a blast ripped the door off its hinges. I returned to Nate and cautioned, we are going to have to wait here until the bombing stops. I climbed into Nate's arms, and we held each other closely. After a few minutes, a hush fell over the room. Nate and I exchanged amused glances. I'm going out there, I announced, moving away from Nate, around the corner. Then I am coming with you, replied Nate, easing around the counter behind me. Standing up, I surveyed the damage, then yelled, you can come out now. Form a single file line and advance to the nearest exit. Wait for further instructions outside. When all the bank employees and customers had exited the trailer, Nate and I followed them out to the quad. Taking the first aid kit out of the basket, We tended to those who needed simple medical attention, such as cuts, bruises, and bleeding. We even made makeshift splints for broken arms and legs, helping the more difficult cases to the town doctor. Later, I looked around, hands on my hips, to see that Nate and I stood near the trailer wreckage alone. I think that we've asked enough questions for today. Let's go back to the apartment and have a nice dinner. I felt a tap on my shoulder. Ms. Williams, a masculine voice questioned. I turned around to find myself face to face with Benjamin Trapper, the man I had pulled from the bank fire. I wanted to thank you for saving my life. He leaned in and kissed my cheek. You remember my husband Benjamin's brother, Nate, I introduced, motioning to the man standing behind me. Yes. Nice to meet you again. Nate nodded. I led Nate and Trapper over to a nearby bench. I sat and patted the seat next to me. How are you, Mr. Trapper? And how is your wife and your 3 kids, was it? 5, 3, and 9 months? Trapper smiled as if he was pleased that I remembered. They are doing wonderful. I realized, coming face to face with my own mortality like that, Ms. Williams, that I was taking life with my wife and kids for granted. It is easily done, I remarked, glancing over at Nate, smiling brightly. I turned my attention back to Mr. Trapper, noting the red blisters on his arms. I see that your blisters didn't go away with that cream either. He shook his head, scrutinizing my arms. But you seem to have gotten rid of them. Yes, with a lot of rest. After chatting with Trapper for a few minutes, we headed back to my apartment.